Level 2 weapons in Tarkov are super interesting this wipe for one primary reason. It mostly coincides with unlocking the flea. Today we'll be looking at the best level 2 weapons and some builds for them, taking into account that you can now buy most of the mid-game ammos on the marketplace. So starting at the beginning, we can see on Prapor 2 we have the VSK. Now this is basically an upgraded version of the 9A91 that we saw on level 1 traders, and obviously this thing is suppressed by default, which is pretty powerful. If we go and have a look at what you can do with it, the answer is not really that much. You can add one of these B3 mounts so that you can then get a laser or flashlight on here. But unfortunately, this isn't available until Skier 3. So until then, you basically have to make do with using the dovetail mount. And I normally like the Cobra on here, like I said last time, because you can use a tactical laser on the side, as well as whatever optic that you prefer and want to put on the top. Other than that, there's not really much you can do to this gun, but for the price of 54k coming integrally suppressed, it's honestly not that bad. This does suffer from the same issues as the 9A91 with the 20 round magazines, which is a bit unfortunate, but BSG's nerf on the fire rate down to 700 RPM actually is probably a benefit for this weapon, because 900 was just a little bit much when we were using 20 rounders. Then we obviously have a bunch of AK pattern weapons. We've got the AK-74N, the AK-S74N, and the AK-74. I typically just pick the one that's the cheapest and start modding that, because you can kind of do whatever you like with any of them because of the way that the rails work. I'm going to start with the AK-74 and edit the preset here. Now, the problem is these guns are actually kind of ready to go at level 1 and 2. You can't improve them that much. Normally it's mainly on ergonomics, because the AK parts that give you tons of recoil reduction aren't available until much higher trader levels. But let's just see, if you do want to mod it out fully, we'll show you exactly what to do. So we take off the rear sight as normal, and on this I'm going to use the Bastion rail cover to allow us to put some optics on there. For the handguard, I'm going to swap the handguard over to the RS47. This comes from Peacekeeper, and we're going to stick this on because there is a different one that I actually kind of like, which is the Academia Dominator from Skier. But this one doesn't have any space for side rails, which is kind of unfortunate. So we're going to use the RS47, and onto this you can attach any kind of laser or flashlight that you like. I think that this is really important these days. You basically need to have a tactical device, because otherwise your point fire is much worse than anybody else that you come across. Onto this, again, we're going to attach the Knight's Armament vertical foregrip. I just don't really rate any of the other grips until you get up to higher trader levels, because 1% of recoil reduction just simply doesn't make enough difference, and often you end up sacrificing ergo for it. On the muzzle brakes, you unlock the DTK1 from Skier, and this one comes at Skier 2, so we can add that on because that just gives us a bit of recoil reduction. And then in terms of stocks, this one you need to add the PT-AKM lock in order to get access to some of the other stocks at level 2, and Skier 2 has the PT1, which does actually do something to the recoil. Mechanic 2 is level 20, which is quite high. It's a bit higher than sort of this build is aimed at, but you can get a saw pistol grip from him. That only does ergonomics, so just add it if you can. If not, then don't worry about it too much. From this point, all you need to do is just add an optic on the top, and this gun is pretty much good to go. A little bit better than stock, definitely a lot better in terms of ergonomics and handling, but this is pretty solid. Now, one question about these is, why would you use this over one of the shorter versions that has a little bit worse recoil, but still manageable, but a lot better ergo? And the reason for this is the accuracy. This has an accuracy of 2, and I actually built a build earlier for the 74U, and I will show you this. It's pretty much the same build, just using slightly different parts as they're applicable to the shorter gun, which is the B11 handguard and the Pilgrim rail instead, but we're still using the same stock, grip, foregrip, and muzzle brake. And this gets you to 74 ergonomics, but 81 recoil instead. As you can see, the accuracy here is 3.44. So when you're in close quarters, anything under 100 meters, this isn't going to make any difference at all, the accuracy. But if you are putting an optic on it, a scope or something, and you're playing on a longer range map, maybe shoreline, then you possibly want to be using the longer gun. My personal preference is for the short ones almost always. I'm normally not in a situation where I'm trying to go for ranged combat, and if I am, then I typically want to be suppressed, and if I want to be suppressed, then typically I use 5.56 rather than 5.45, because the suppressors here are actually worse on recoil, except for the reactor, which is like super high level, high end builds one. All of these are worse for recoil, so they don't really do much other than making you, slightly quieter. So I'm not going to go through the full build for like the AKM and the AKMS. You can build them pretty much the same way. These mod out almost identically. I guess the only difference is about muzzle brakes, and the Dynacomp AK is kind of the equivalent to the DTK1 on the AKM, but otherwise you could just add all of the same stuff on here. It's exactly the same build. You've got the same locks, and you've got the same stocks, you've got the same mounts, you've got the same handguards. So you could just build it exactly the same as the AK-74 if you want to make one in 7.62x39 instead, but obviously you've got to watch out for the fact that it does kick quite a bit more. He also now has the Kedabi submachine gun, which you can buy if you want to do a quick budget run. This is pretty much the same as the weapons that we had on level 1, except only 36k, so it is very cheap. But the bullets, you need to hit somebody in the head. With the new armor system, you will just die if you only hit body shots with it. And then he has 2 bolties, the Mosin Sniper and the SV98. This SV98 barter is actually usually pretty cheap, especially if you need a second one for Peacekeeper, but the SV is a decent bolt action. It's probably one of the better ones because it's a little bit modular and you can put a suppressor on it, and it's the only other one that fires 7.62x54R alongside the Mosin, so it fires very, very powerful bullets that you can buy early like LPS. So moving over onto Skier 2. The first weapon on Skier, I kind of immediately dismissed it, but the MCX itself, I think this barter is a little bit too much money. But when you look on the fleet, you can sometimes buy these for, about 60k or something, which is kind of in line with the other 5.56 weapons, actually. When we go through and have a look at the builds for them, there's not actually a great deal that you can do with the MCX. And that's true even into the end game. So at level 2 traders, it's even more limited. And so really all we can do is just add on some kind of vertical foregrip. I was using this one, the Sig Sauer vertical foregrip, just because it's easy and relatively cheap. And then you can just buy this suppressor. This suppressor is a very specific one, and so it's normally not that much on the flea market. It's the 5.56 suppressors often cost a bit more. And the build that comes from Skier and most of the builds on the fleet, it depends whether someone stripped it completely down or not. They usually come with the 2-port brake as well as the T-lock. So both of these 2 parts are already there for you, and all you need to do is just buy this suppressor as well. At this stage, you can upgrade the pistol grip. A Peacekeeper 2, you can get an MIAD grip, which adds 2 more ergo onto the weapon. And then we could just put on the obligatory side rail for some kind of laser or flashlight, whatever it is that you decide to choose, as well as an optic. This gets you to 44 ergo, which is quite low, but 67 recoil is pretty much in line with the other 5.56 guns. Now, the reason why you'd want to do this for the MCX is when you look at the ammunition availability, you can buy M62 Tracer on the flea market, and this is actually not that bad. Like, the reason why it's so cheap is because not many people are using the MCX at the moment, but with 54 damage and 36 penetration for under 500 rubles, that's actually really good value. So this is potentially an option, but of course it's very dependent upon MCXs being on the fleet to buy in the first place, and then the ammo also being available on the fleet to buy. This isn't really one from level 2 traders per se. This is more about the flea market and the open fleet. The other interesting weapon that is on Skier is the RFB. I'm not a massive semi-auto guy particularly, but I've seen some people using the RFB to great effect. The fact that it only costs 2 gas analyzers to barter for it means that this gun is dirt cheap. That is 28,000 rubles for the RFB, which is insanely low priced for a 7.62x51 NATO weapon, but obviously you can't really do much to it. There's no point putting on any of these foregrips at all on the RFB because it's a bullpup and you can hardly reduce the recoil anyway, so you do just want to stick on the VFG. There's a recurring theme here. And then you want to figure out some kind of optics combination up here that you'd like. From Jaeger 2, you can start buying the Lebev mount, which allows you to use 30mm scopes. And the reason why this is interesting is there's a couple that are actually pricing quite cheaply right now. The March Tactical is maybe usable, but it's 3-24, but now we have smooth zoom. It makes it a lot more usable than it was previously. But if we scroll down a little bit further and through the Leopold as well, then you end up into the Barrises and the Schmidt & Benders. I think the Schmidt & Bender is really, really undervalued. At 50k, this is a great optic. It's got a really nice clear reticle, and yes, it goes from 1 to 8, but as I said, you can smooth zoom it, so it's really not that bad. In an RFB, this thing can be really good for budget. The only other part of the RFB that you want to change is obviously putting on a suppressor. Suppressors for 7.62x51 are actually kind of hard to come by at this trader level, but the one that you can get access to is the DT Hybrid. You can get the mount on Peacekeeper, and then Mechanic has the barter for the Hybrid 46 itself for the 4 sticks of RAM. Everybody will be familiar with this from doing Gunsmith in the past if you've played the game previously, and the Hybrid is really good on ergonomics, but less so on recoil, which actually works really well for the RFB because we didn't really care about the recoil anyway. You can swap over the magazine once you get to Mechanic 2 to the polymer version, which gives you a little bit more. It's still the same capacity at 20 rounds, but you get 3 more ergo than the metal mag. So the RFB can certainly be quite good. I've used it a lot in the past, but in the current recoil model, I tend to prefer full auto. So moving over to Peacekeeper. Well, why are the 5.56 guns really, really good this wipe, in my opinion? Well, it's because of the ammo and the fleas. When we go and look at the ammunition, specifically M855, this thing is a Peacekeeper 3 unlock. But you can see on the flea market is extremely cheap. People are buying their allocation of M855 and they are flipping it onto the fleet once they get to Peacekeeper 3. So once you get to level 15, you can basically buy level 3 trader ammo at level 15 because people are just pushing it straight back onto the flea market. This makes that these guns a lot more usable than they used to be. M855 used to cost a lot of money, something like 800 rubles per round. So once you ran out, you were down to using FMJ and other bad rounds like that. You don't need to do that anymore. You can use M855. Now, the M4, I think, is a bit expensive for what it is. You also need to mod it, and you don't have access to enough good parts. But if you do really, really, really want to use the M4, then I do have a build that can work, and I did use it a little bit in some raids, and it was okay. So this one's going to look very tan. Firstly, we're going to get rid of the handle and we're going to change the handguard over to the MOE SL, which is this one here. I'm then going to put on a rail underneath and add the VFG, of course, like on all the other builds. We're going to add the MIAD grip on this as well, because this is the same from the M4 as to the MCX. And then in terms of stocks, we're going to actually add this, the Chris Defiance DS150. I guess in this particular build, we may as well add the FDE version because it's in keeping with all of our other parts. Clearly, this handguard allows you to attach a rail of some kind. So if you look down there, we've got the M-Lock rail, and we're going to put on a laser or a flashlight, as we always should, whatever it is that you prefer. And then the gas block, you kind of want to change this over to the RG block. You get this one pretty early when you do Gunsmith. I think you have to do Gunsmith Part 1 for this, and that just flattens it down. So it means that you can basically use any optic here, and you won't have a gas block sticking up in the way. Now, suppressors for 5.56 are very, very interesting. The information is a little bit hard to find, especially if you're a newcomer, and it's very easy to forget what goes with what. But in terms of the order of things you should be looking for, on Peacekeeper 2, you get access to this, the QDC Flash Suppressor Kit. This one then allows you to add either the NT4 in black or the NT4 in tan. And these two are pretty cheap on the flea market. If you do a link search on the muzzle brake itself, and we go to suppressors, we can just pick whichever one is the cheapest. It's usually the tan, sometimes it's the black, it just kind of swings roundabouts and depends. But we're going to add the tan one here just for the sheer aesthetics. Another option is on Skier 2, and that is the War Comp. The War Comp is a surefire muzzle, and so this allows you access to a different set of suppressors. There's in fact 3 here. There is the monster itself, the surefire monster. You have this one, the Surefire RC2, which has slightly better recoil, but slightly worse ergo. And then there is one more, which we don't really want to be buying right now. It's probably going to find some down here. They're the Mini Monster. So these have really good ergonomics, but nowhere near as good recoil. They're quite expensive at the moment, so I would steer clear of those. But let's put on the RC2 just for the time being, because the RC2 and the Monster themselves kind of price at about the same level. They do move around. Between these pairs of compensators and suppressors, you can actually suppress these guns really easily. The small upgrade to this is at Mechanic 2 when you get to level 20, and this is the SF3P. This replaces the War Comp. This again is compatible with all of the surefire suppressors, so the Monster, the Mini Monster, and the RC2, but it gives you a little bit more recoil reduction than the War Comp. So swap to using the SF3P once you get to Mechanic 2 away from the War Comp. So this build at 51 ergonomics and 70 vertical recoil honestly is pretty good. Like, this is fine. You can't make it that much better than this at this stage. You just don't have access to the parts, but for the price, this one isn't too bad. Now, moving away from the M4 and onto another gun that is actually probably my favorite weapon this wipe, and it's been my favorite weapon in previous wipes as well, is the G36. So at Peacekeeper 2, we have access to the G36C, which is fantastic because we don't have to really do anything to this at all. We just put on a vertical foregrip, and I'm, again, as usual, we're just going to go and add the Knight's vertical, which is down here. And this really doesn't require modding. You can basically just add the side rail, G36 side, and some kind of flashlight or tactical device on the edge, and then we just want to pick a suppressor. This is exactly the same combinations that we just talked about. So War Comp plus the Monster or the RC2, or the SF3P if you've got that unlocked, or you use the one from Peacekeeper instead and go for the NT4. So that's exactly the same as the M4, but that's all you have to do. It's super, super quick to build. It's nice and short, so it's easy to use indoors, and I really like this gun. It's not too crazy on the fire rate. It's 750, so it's a little bit lower than the M4, but it's definitely a lot faster than the AKs, so I just like it. It's a really nice middle ground weapon, and it's actually quite a lot cheaper than the M4 as well. Even just the base price looking on Peacekeeper himself, you can see 479 versus 680. On the flea market, these are quite a lot cheaper, but this is because this is the very, very long variant. This is the main variant of the G36 that you normally find. You might actually find that it is a little bit cheaper to take one of these really long versions and mod it down to the short one. If you want to do that, you have to take off the 6 vent, put on the short 228mm barrel, put the 2 vent back on, add the gas block back on, and then you're kind of ready to start. You probably don't want to have this scope on up here, so you put the regular G36 rail on. And this looks very much like the one that we were just modding out before. So it kind of depends on what you want to do, whether you want to faff about with rebuilding one on the fleet or not. A new weapon that Peacekeeper has is this, the Uzi Pro pistol. This is pretty fun, honestly. It's very, very similar to the MP9. In fact, it's almost identical to the MP9. You could just use it in this format if you want to, where it's just being held in one hand and is basically a glorified pistol SMG, which is kind of crazy. Or you can make it into a little bit more of an actual SMG, adding something like this, the Pro Stabilizing Brace, as well as changing over the barrel to this one, 114mm threaded barrel, onto which you can put various different types of suppressors. The cheapest one by far is the 9x19 rotor version. The reason why this ends up being so cheap is you can barter this for a Majika coffee, and these are like 9k, so you can suppress this gun for about 10,000 rubles, which is pretty nuts. You can add a vertical foregrip to this weapon as well, but we're actually not going to use the VHG for the first time, because there's a special foregrip that only works with the Uzi, which is the Uzi Pro A3 Tactical M-Lock Handguard. We're going to add this on, and that then allows you to add a little M-lock rail, and then you can put a laser on. Because if without this, you can't actually put a laser or a flashlight on this weapon, so that would be a real problem for an SMG like this. You could buy the M-lock rail from Mechanic 2, so it's a level 20, not straight at level 15 traders, so you have to be level 20 and have Mechanic 2 first, but then obviously you just put a sight on the top, whatever it is that you want to have, and then just go with it. This is almost identical, as I said, to the MP9N. The original variant of the Uzi is 600 RPM, but this is the 1075 version, so it's 25 short of the MP9N, and they both handle almost identically. Peacekeeper's other choices in the SMG category really are, the MPX Silenced, which is a very good gun, but with the armor change, it's more of a head tapper. The regular MPX, the MP5 SD after you've finished Scrap Metal, which again is a head tapper, but it can be quite nice. And the only thing that I would say about these is that you're not entirely reliant on 9mm PST anymore. 9mm PST just really struggles to go through even class 3 helmets and that kind of thing. But you can now buy AP6.3 at Peacekeeper 3 and reflip it onto the flea market. So in the same way as with 855, AP6.3 is now much cheaper than it used to be. So only 400 rubles per round, which is expensive-ish, but not really. Given the fire rate, it is quite a lot. But AP6.3 will then go through class 3 helmets with its 30 pen, and it will actually start to eat through things like neck armors. Obviously, any of the class 4 helmets will cause you some slight issues, so you are still kind of aiming for headshots with these guns. But because of the low recoil on them, it does actually make it possible. So you just kind of pick your favorite. I think I really do like the MPX Silence. It's one of my favorite guns in the game for getting headshots with. Not using much this wipe, but I did a lot last wipe. We also have the P90 SBR. This only costs 2 military cables, so that's actually not too bad. That's about 60k for the P90, which is pretty decent. You could buy the P90 mags at Peacekeeper 2 as well, which is good. And the ammo for this, again, is in a very similar camp. You used to only be able to buy L191 once you got to Peacekeeper 3, but now you can buy it because people are flipping it onto the flea market away from the trader, and you can basically buy it at the same price as you can buy it on Peacekeeper 3. Same thing with SS190. This is expensive, and this will come down in price as more people get up to Peacekeeper level 4, but SS190 is obviously really good. 37 penetration and 49 damage, and you can buy this readily on the fleet as well. So all of these guns are actually much more usable, and especially if you want to top load with some good ammo. I actually didn't say, but with the 9mm ones, you can also buy PvP as well. That's normally about 1,000 a round at the moment. That's not really very accessible to most players at the moment, but you can top load with PvP and also use AP6.3 for the 9mm versions. These are just a lot better than they were, but this was kind of needed with the armor change. The final one, the poor little UMP, it's sort of been left out at the end. This one is not really as good. You basically have to use Match FMJ because the 45 AP bullet is really expensive right now, like 900, 1,000 rubles. You can top load with this if you really want to, but given the slow fire rate, I would rather go with one of the other guns. I think the UMP is probably just a little bit left behind at the moment. So from here, I'm going to skip over to Jaeger because Mechanic is at level 20, just that much higher. But I would say that Jaeger's pretty underwhelming. You get the Vepr Hunter, but the RFB is just better. There's like a bunch of different shotguns, which, yeah, they're useful because you need them for setup and that kind of thing. You can buy the Desert Eagle in 357, so unfortunately not the 50 Action Express caliber, which is the fun one. And you also have the M700, which is a decent bolt action rifle. Given that it trades for 2 repellents, and these are really expensive right now, it's not really doable at the moment. Jaeger is more interesting for some of the parts that he has, in particular the scope mounts. It's this one, the Lebev 30mm scope mount that I mentioned before. Until you're at Jaeger 2, it's actually very difficult to get the TAC 30 or the Splittermender 128 or any of those to fit because these scope mounts are just pretty expensive. But you get access to them on Jaeger 2, which is quite handy. For shotguns though, there's lots of different cartridges. Obviously you have buckshots and you also have your slugs, but the one that I always use is Piranha, and you can buy this pretty cheaply, 231 rubles on Jaeger, and this is really good for doing setup. The Piranha and Flechette shells just blast through armor, and that's kind of the point. You just aim at sort of top center of mass, hope you catch them in the face, you might catch them in the neck, and eventually, even if you do some misses, then you'll be able to get through their armor eventually. So I really like Piranha. The fact this is on Jaeger 2, this makes setup a hell of a lot easier in my opinion, just because of the way that I play with these particular weapons. So finally moving over to Mechanic, I actually think Mechanic is really underwhelming. Most of his stuff got moved over onto Ref, and I don't have Ref level 2 because Ref level 2 is actually very difficult to get these days. And again, it's all about GP coins, so I'm not going to cover that in this particular video. But at the moment, most of the barters that are remaining are just very expensive and not really worth it. The M4 can be interesting if pro kills come down a little bit. It's a good way to scalp Elkan Spectres off these guns at some point, but a lot of these things are just expensive and just not really worth it right now. So the only interesting thing that I think is on Mechanic is really this, the VOG 17 grenade for a fuse. It means you can get these grenades for about 10k, but other than that, I just leave all of this stuff and use the things on the other traders. So overall, I think that the G36C is probably my favourite weapon this wipe from level 2 traders, just because of the availability of the ammunition and the fact that suppressors are not really that hard to come by for them. If you like SMGs, the MPX SD or the MP5 SD can be very good, given that you can buy the ammo off the flea market as well, and obviously some of the AK builds with their newly buffed ammo, PT having a little bit more damage to it, those builds can actually be pretty good as well. With a slightly lower fire rate, they're still very controllable, and they're just kind of the workhorse guns of going around and getting stuff done on the cheap, especially the 74U builds. So next up, if you haven't checked out my armor guide yet for the early wipe, then go and do that next. Otherwise, as usual, big shout out to all my patrons, and as always, have fun in your raids.